So let's get started. I mean, about me, I was a vegetarian for 25 years. I also am from Berkeley, California, hotbed of vegetarianism. So I've obviously traveled a long ways to the point where I wrote a book that has a piece of meat on the cover. But I have since cut down on grains and sugars, and I am no longer fearing meat or bacon. I've really changed the way that I eat. It's made a big difference for me in terms of my health, and we're going to talk about food and health. And I guess because I mainly speak at medical conferences, I always put out my disclosures, which are that I have no disclosures. I don't accept any funds from any industry or any company, and never have. And I spent nearly 9 years researching this book and spoke to hundreds of scientists all over the world, nutrition scientists, and read thousands of scientific papers. And I've now been doing this for almost 20 years, which seems insane, but there's just so much out there. It's an endless rabbit hole. And I want to talk to you today about the confusion that everybody feels. They feel about diet, like eggs or meat, good for me, bad for me. I think also as producers, you have questions like, well, what about the saturated fat and cholesterol in my product? People ask me about that. What do I say? So we're going to cover some of those really important topics today and look at well, what does the science say on this? And we're going to do that in part by looking at the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are people are like, well, what is that? What are we even talking about? I don't even know what that policy is. And that's basically if you've grown up with one of these. If you're my age, it was the food pyramid. If you're younger, easy to be younger, it's My Plate. And basically that's a diet where the healthy diet is more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, and de-emphasizing or only eating low-fat dairy and lean meat. And if you choose an added fat, that would be vegetable oils and not natural animal fats. That is what is a healthy diet according to the dietary guidelines. And why are we talking about that? Well, they just turn out to be incredibly influential. You can just take a picture of this because it's kind of hard to absorb all at once. But they are downloaded. They are considered the gold standard. All federal food programs, so that's school lunches, feeding programs for the elderly, the military, everybody is required to follow the dietary guidelines. And they're also downloaded to doctors, dietitians, nutritionists, nurses. So when you go to your nutritionist and say, what should I eat, or your doctor, they're going to give you the dietary guidelines. I mean, even if you don't know about this policy reaches virtually each and every American. So, and they happen to coincide with exactly in the year that they were launched, 1980, with a dramatic increase in obesity. This is not to say that they caused obesity, but they have clearly failed to prevent obesity. And there is another curve like this, for diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I mean, and any one of the diet-related diseases, there's something like this. And most often we hear, well, Americans don't follow the guidelines. I mean, they don't even know about them, and they barely follow them. So this is the very best government data that we have. There's also one like this that's in calories, and they all say the exactly same thing. We eat more fruits and vegetables. All those blue lines are all the things we're supposed to eat, and they've all gone up. We eat more fruits and vegetables, more grains, more vegetable oils by quite a lot. And all the red lines are the things that we're supposed to decrease. All those foods going down. Red meat has gone down, butter, eggs, whole milk, all of those have decreased. And this is not a cherry-picked graph, and there's not a single category that you can find in this data set that does not show that we've complied with the guidelines, including leafy green vegetables. We eat more leafy green vegetables than we did in 1970. And we've also done this in terms of our macronutrients. So we do eat more carbohydrates, which we've been told to do. We've decreased our fat as a percentage of calories, and we've also decreased our saturated fat as we've been told. So we've been pretty good. I also want to show you a meat chart, just because we're constantly told we eat way too much meat. But this is actually our consumption of meat since 1800. There's a fantastic book where someone went back and researched looking at slave logs and all kinds of market logs to try to figure out what Americans ate in terms of meat back in 1800, and it was way more than we eat today. I mean, even the slaves on plantations ate more red meat and they were allotted more red meat than we typically eat today. And you can also see, I think it's also notable to see that, as red meat has come down, what has replaced it? Chicken. Chicken used to be considered a luxury, rarely eaten, and is now has risen dramatically. Okay, so let's go to the guidelines. How did they affect our eating behavior? Well, this was the first one. This is this single little one-page pamphlet in 1980 that came out, and it told us to avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And that's, where we first saw that idea. And where did that come from? Let's just take a step back in history a little bit more. It really all started with the American Heart Association in 1961. This is the first advice anywhere in the world telling us to limit our saturated fat and cholesterol. It all began with the American Heart Association. That is like the little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today, still in large part. So this American Heart Association advice, that came about because in 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack, and he was out of the Oval Office for 10 days. So, and understand, heart attacks, heart disease, it's hard to imagine, but in the early 1900s, it was very rare, almost never seen in hospitals. Doctors had written textbooks about it, but they didn't see it much, so they knew what it was. And that had then risen to become the #1 killer in the nation, mainly among men. It wasn't occurring to women yet. So the whole focus of the country was, well, what causes heart disease? And there were a number of theories out there. It was vitamin deficiency, increasing number of auto exhaust on the road due to the rising number of cars. Maybe it was the type A personality, men going to work, screaming at everybody, and then having a heart attack. Those were all viable theories, but here's the theory that won out. It was a theory by a University of Minnesota professor, Ansel Keys. Maybe you've heard of him. It was called the diet heart hypothesis, and he said that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, if you ate them, they would clog your artery, they would raise your serum cholesterol in your blood, clog your arteries like hot oil going down a cold stovepipe, slowly congeal and block your arteries and cause a heart attack. And that was called the diet heart hypothesis. And he came out with that in the late 1950s. Okay. So then you remember the American Heart Association made that official policy in 1961. They did that really based on almost no evidence. So then, this is a very shortened version of the history, but basically governments around the world who were adopting this idea, they said, we need to try to prove that the saturated fat hypothesis is correct. So this is what happened. There were actually a large number of government-funded, randomized controlled clinical trials. That's what's considered the gold standard in science. You can't get a drug normally unless that drug has gone through a randomized controlled clinical trial. And these were done on what's called hard endpoints. It means they followed people all the way up to the time that they had a heart attack or died, right? They weren't just looking at their cholesterol. They were looking at something that really made a difference. And altogether, it was over 75,000 men and women in these experiments. So this is like the most tested nutrition hypothesis in the history of nutrition science. All this took place in the 1960s and 70s, and the results was no effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular or total mortality. Nobody knows about this. And why do you not know about these studies? Well, I mean, in large part, and again, I'm having to really compress and summarize, these studies were basically buried. I mean, there's a story, I don't think I have time to tell today, but it's about how, one study came out, and the researchers were so disappointed in how it came out, because one of them was Ansel Keys. that they didn't publish it for 17 years. Another one we found in the basement of the National Institutes of Health, part of the Framingham study, said saturated fats were not a problem. The one volume out of 26 volumes never published. I mean, this just goes on and on. The studies are not cited. They weren't included in roundup reviews. They just kind of disappeared. I wrote a cover story for the BMJ that basically established this in the peer review literature, saying that these studies were never, these clinical trials on 75,000 plus people have never been reviewed by any of the official expert committees that write our guidelines. So this is the most authoritative paper that now exists on saturated fats that went back and reviewed all those clinical trials finally in 2020. It said it concluded there's no robust evidence for the current population-wide arbitrary upper limits on saturated fat consumption in the United States to show that they will prevent heart disease. This paper, sorry, I can't see down there, includes 4 scientists who previously served on the expert committees that wrote the guidelines, and they're basically saying, we got it wrong. And this was named one of the top papers of the year by the American College of Cardiology, this very prestigious journal where it came out. That's still the most authoritative paper out there. I think I'm going to just skip a little bit of this because we're running out of time. But I wanted to tell you what goes on at our national policy level. So this is the most recent review by the expert committee that runs the guidelines in 2020. They did this review. A bunch of authors, including myself, analyzed this review and wrote a paper on it. We looked at all the studies that they had included in their review paper. Here they are, all broken out. You just look at this column, and it shows you, this is the percentage of studies that show that do not support the idea that saturated fats causes any kind of cardiovascular problem. So in some cases, let's say 88% of the studies do not support it in total, that there's any effect on any of these cardiovascular outpoints. Okay, so most of the studies do not support this. And what was their conclusion of their review based on those studies? The evidence against saturated fats is strong. So they were ignoring, basically, their own evidence. I don't know how to explain that. Dietary cholesterol, let's see what happens with that. That's why you avoid dietary cholesterols in meat, egg yolks. There are actually no more cholesterol caps. How many people know that? There are no more formal cholesterol caps. They were dropped by the American Heart Association in 2013. And then they were dropped by the dietary guidelines in 2015 because they found there was no appreciable relationship between the consumption of dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol. Okay, they were reviewed again in 2020, found insufficient evidence to link dietary cholesterol with blood cholesterol, meaning the cholesterol you eat does not affect the cholesterol in your blood. What did the dietary guidelines decide to recommend in 2020? Our recommended patterns are lower in cholesterol. Again, how do you explain that? It's not based on the evidence. So the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is really the highest scientific authority in the land, did the first ever outside peer review of the dietary guideline process, and they found a number of serious problems. I'm just going to stick with the last one here. And basically they said, we need to redesign this process because the methodology is not up to par and it's not working. I'm going to skip through another one. I guess I'm really getting close to my time. So just another important paper on the dietary guidelines. I mean, this is one of the ways the guidelines really affects our kids in schools and anywhere the guidelines you're consuming. I mean, this is, just go to PepsiCo's school service and see what is on there. These are all USDA-approved foods that can be served to your kids in schools or handed out to women and infant children. Another paper that we did found that 95% of the last dietary guideline expert committee had at least one undisclosed conflict with a food or pharmaceutical company, and many of them had many more such conflicts. I'm going to just do one more review, which is on the review on what's happened to the reviews on low carbohydrate diets, which I think is important because this is the only natural foods approach other than starvation that successfully reverses diabetes, type 2 diabetes. On low carbohydrate diets, there was a conversation, and this is emails that we obtained by doing Freedom of Information Act requests, asking, saying there's a lot of interest, and we want to know why we haven't reviewed the low carbohydrate diets as a dietary pattern of choice, is the question that's being asked these committee members, these expert committees. And they said, well, we did do a review of low carbohydrate diets, but we put it in the methodology section, where it doesn't belong. It belongs in the results section so that it can be included in the results. And so Frank Hu, a professor at Harvard School of Public Health, he pipes up and says, given the popularity of a low-carb pattern and the enormous amount of research that has been generated in the past several years, this is in 2015, I was wondering if we should have a separate section on low-carb diets rather than burying it in the methodology section. He says, people who are familiar with the field may complain that we gloss over recent evidence and don't give low-carb diets the sufficient attention that they deserve. So in 2020, they did do a review of low-carb diets, but could find 0 studies on it. Okay, at that time, there's probably, if you search PubMed, which is a clinical trial database, you'll come up with like 1,000 hits. So they could find 0, and now for the next guidelines in 2025, they're not even going to ask a question on it. Like, not even going to try. So I guess I want to just talk very briefly about the erosion of the protein category, and this is also important for what is served in school meals and hospitals and all these places. When it started, the protein category included meat and fish and poultry and eggs, but also included beans and peas. And then nuts were added to the poultry category as an equivalent. And then soy products were added, and seeds, and then lentils. And this is just a chart to show you that animal-based proteins, these are 2 measures of complete proteins. You can see that the higher the number, the more complete you are. You cannot get complete proteins as easily from plant foods. Almost all plant foods have inferior amounts of incomplete proteins. And just to give you an example of that, if you have spare ribs, these are pork spare ribs, 3 ounces, you get 24 grams of complete protein. You have 0 carbohydrates, so that means you're not spiking your blood sugar, and at 330 calories. If you try to get that from 3 ounces of peanut butter, you get less protein, quite a lot of carbohydrate, and added sugars, and it's 508 calories. And that's not even a complete protein. You'd have to make that to complete, you'd have to add something like beans, which adds more calories and more carbohydrate. So that's just not a great trade-off. In sum, pork is a high-quality source of protein, low calories, no carbohydrate, so no sugar in your body. There's no reason to fear saturated fat or cholesterol. If you seek to reverse disease, cutting out meat is not the best way to do that. It's not even a good way to do that. You should reduce your sugars and grains and not the fat. And that the dietary guidelines really need reform because they do not reflect the best and most current science. Okay, that's it. Enjoy your food, which I'm sure you all do. I can't wait for lunch. Thank you.
Put back up the last slide, or can that be done? Hey, no problem. I feel so much better about the pile of bacon and eggs I had for breakfast now. So thank you so much, and sorry you had to really rush through that because it's fascinating stuff that I'm sure everybody would love to see the slides on. And if I can just get comfortable here. Okay, so what you basically said was that the doctrine that we'd been taught about, cut out all that fatty meat and, just eat some vegetables and have a low-fat diet was not evidence-based. And yet you wrote your book. I interviewed you in 2014. And I thought, okay, the tide of research is really changing. Certainly that will be reflected in guidelines. and yet it hasn't. What do you think is behind that?
So first of all, let me say one thing I didn't show up there, but the low-fat diet is technically gone. Like, that is a change that has happened. They have dropped the words low-fat. Although, if you look at their formularies, they were, is this going in and out? So if you look at the formularies of what they're serving to people, it is a de facto low-carb diet, so about 30% of
Low-fat.
calories.
De facto low fat?
Yes. So, but they don't use those words anymore. Maybe I should just take this off and we'll just share the mic. Yeah. All right.
Go ahead.
But the main reason the dietary guidelines won't change, well, there's two main reasons. One is just very hard to change the status quo. Bureaucracies don't like to change. Professors don't like to change. Their whole careers have been based on, advocating for a certain point of view. So that's there's cognitive dissonance. Like, there's a huge rigidity. There are rigidities that are built into the system. The second thing is that there are just massive vested interests in this. I mean, the fact that 95% of the expert committee has a conflict of interest, and also that there are literally almost 100 companies, big food companies, that have partnerships with the very office that runs the dietary guidelines. I mean, there's so much big food influence inside the USDA. So, I mean, I think that's just, it's very hard. It's going to be very hard. And, think of all the, so there's $600 million or 600 billion, what is it? $600 billion in programs the USDA runs, food and all those assistance programs. Companies have huge contracts with them. The reason, like, your kid literally can get Dora Explorer cereal in school, and that's because those companies have contracts.
Yeah, and they get what are called rebates, but other people would call them kickbacks in school districts.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people are finding is that the food our grandmothers ate, making sauerkraut and eating whole milk and cream and having animals that are raised on the farm in more natural ways, are ways people are going, like, I make sauerkraut at home. I eat lard and eggs every day. And yet that old way is, even though there's more evidence showing that it's healthier, it's not catching on, and you have even faced pushback from some of the ivory towers of nutrition. What do you make of that?
Well, again, it's kind of the same answer, really. Like, there's let's say the Harvard School of Nutrition is, they're very invested in a vegan diet. They're doing that. Their whole careers have been published based on trying to promote plant-based diets.
And when you cut out, you were saying the Harvard School of Nutrition, so like Walter Willett. Although Walter
Thanks.
Willett did have a piece in saying that, we should not be giving kids skim milk. When I was covering the National School Lunch Program in 2010, under the Obama administration, and probably under very good intentions, they said that kids could only drink skim milk in school. It was cut out, and it was chocolate skim milk is what they were drinking. And I talked to, let's say, the executive director of Let's Move, who told me, Monica, on the slide, I would never drink skim milk. I'm a whole milk person. And yet, he was backing guidelines that would make sure the kids had the opposite. So I guess that shows how hard it is to change policy.
It is super hard to change. I mean, the move away from whole milk is also associated, it's political. So that was something that Michelle Obama did, and many people do not want to reverse her legacy. They consider that an improvement. It's based on our enduring belief that saturated fats are bad for health, even though that's never been demonstrated to be true for children, that it causes heart disease, or it's never been demonstrated to be true for adults either.
And you need the fat to absorb the nutrients.
And you need the fat. If without the fat, you're not going to absorb the nutrients. And kids throw away tasteless, watery milk. They just don't like the taste in it. That's why they had to give them chocolate and strawberry milk, so they actually, with lots of sugar, to actually drink it. But it's very hard to get Democrats. So there was just a vote to, there's a bill pending in Congress right now to restore whole milk in schools. Please support your congressperson.
It's already been passed like on a state level in Pennsylvania, but a Kansas representative is pushing it on a national level.
Yeah, I don't know if the one actually passed in Pennsylvania to put it in the schools because the
I know it passed the
USDA.
Senate. I don't know if it passed.
Yeah, because actually what happened is the USDA threatened to
Oh.
pull all the entire state school funding if they
Wow.
authorized whole milk. So here you see, and none of the Democrats in the committee voted to pass that bill. So here you see again, it's falling along political lines that have to do with, Democratic politics and you see the entrenchment of the USDA because they're devoted to their previous policies for many, many reasons. And so it's just...
Sorry,
now,
USDA folks out there.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's very hard to make evidence-based nutrition decisions due to all these interests. And now, I mean, you and I talked about this earlier, but now, and this is true of Harvard, which is that there's a climate imperative, so that this belief that we should not eat, definitely not meat, and maybe not dairy either, in order to save the climate.
Well, that is a really good question. I mean, I talked to this guy, Eaton Boyd, who was sort of the godfather of paleo, and he said, I believe that the science shows that eating a paleo diet or a low-carb diet is the best for health. I don't think it's the best for the planet. And so what would folks say to that? Have farmers that actually use practices that are better for the planet?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it. I think regenerative agriculture is the way forward for that. I think what I lament in this whole debate is that there's virtually no one at the table talking about human health. What happens to humans when you take meat off the plate and maybe and dairy off the plate? And I just recently, I don't know if this analogy works for people, but I recently thought, like, what if you decided at a zoo, we're just not going to feed the animals any meat anymore? And we're just going to, it's a decision for the climate, and we're not going to take into consideration the health of the animals. Well, like, will the lions get diabetic if you just feed them grains and obese? I mean, what? But it's like, we have to think about the health of the animals. Like, we're the animals here. What about our health? I mean, you saw from the comparison of spare ribs to peanut butter, if we go to plant-based proteins, way higher calories, much higher carbohydrate, which drives obesity and diabetes, you're not getting, there's quite a number of essential vitamins and minerals you cannot get from plants, like B12 is one that most people know. It causes all kinds of health problems and pretty reliably contributes to neurological problems in infants if you don't have enough B12. Vitamin D3, the proper form of vitamin A, omega-3s, calcium. I mean, these aren't just, like, you can't just have these or not have these. And many people cannot absorb them in supplement form. Some people can, some people can't. So you need these to be healthy. We cannot really think of moving to a plant-based diet without considering the impact on human health. And by the way, unhealthy people also have an impact on the climate. The healthcare system contributes at least 8.5% of greenhouse gases by a kind of an Obama-era estimate, and I think that it's probably higher now. But so, I just think, should we be balancing the carbon equation on the backs of our health? We need to talk about our health. Is it okay to have meatless Mondays and children not to have complete proteins in school when they need to be growing? Their brains and their bodies need to be growing. Maybe we should do something else. Maybe we should say, or let's make it people's choice. Would you rather take one less transatlantic flight a year or go vegan for 4 years, which is roughly the carbon equivalent? I mean, people should be able to choose how they want to balance their carbon. And if they don't want to put their health or the health of their children at risk, that ought to be their choice. So I think the fact that human nutrition hasn't even been part of this conversation, at least that I see in conferences and the global conference in Egypt, it's just people talking about human health are not at that table. And that really concerns me because it needs to be part of the deliberations over these policies.
Do you see any hope that that these studies that you cite will be considered in the future? 2025, that's our next one, and DGAC, which is a a strange acronym that they use in the USDA, Dietary Guidelines
Advisory
Committee. Do you see any better candidates on DGAC who have fewer conflicts of interest?
Not really. I mean, I'm not hugely optimistic. We have a very hardcore vegan on that committee, funded by Impossible Burger, and there's another woman who's basically a spokesperson for Wegovy.
What's that? What's her Wegovy?
Oh, Wegovy is Novo Nordisk is I think, aren't they the maker of the weight
diabetes
loss
medicine?
injections,
Oh.
right? Or I guess it's for diabetes. But the whole point is, this is somebody who's funded by industries with injections and pills to solve diet-related diseases. She's on a panel to look at nutritional solutions, but she's gone on the record and made a whole bunch, was on TV saying it's, obesity is a genetic problem. Well, that serves the pharmaceutical industry that she works for.
So basically, what you eat doesn't affect anything.
What you eat doesn't really matter. I mean, of course of course there are genetic elements, but it's not the major driving factor. I mean,
Coca-Cola says the same thing. They say just exercise more, so you get it
yeah.
on all ends. Well, I mean, and I should say that I know plenty of vegans who are very healthy and who do watch what supplements they have, but I know lots of carnivores who are very healthy. I know people who are omnivores who are very unhealthy and very unhealthy vegans. So it's not like one size fits all. But I mean, the studies you cite are very compelling at the same time, and the fact that they are not considered in these guidelines. It's a fascinating tale, and I'm just surprised after more than a decade of your research that more hasn't changed. Are you surprised?
I am a little bit. I mean, actually what I have seen is the shrinking openness of the press to talking about these issues. I mean, I think it's even getting worse, actually, and I don't know. I mean, there's been other discussions about the media, but I think the influence of, especially the pharmaceutical industry on the media, is that it has really closed the opportunity for journalists like me, like Gary Taubes. I mean, we were routinely published in the New York Times, and now the Times won't even touch any of these subjects.
Really?
Yeah, I really see, and I see a shrinking number of really good nutrition journalists dealing with, even with issues like sugar. 5 years ago, there were a bunch of articles in the Times about sugar, talking like what could be an easier topic to all hold hands on, right? But you barely see any reporting about the dangers of sugar. So I think that the control of the media is extremely worrisome, and so yeah, I do not think that it's gotten better. But we have a presidential election coming up, and I'm scrambling around to find somebody who will platform some of these issues, because I think they're just incredibly important. Yeah. Well, I mean, just take the issue, like, we can reverse type 2 diabetes. More than half of Americans have prediabetes or diabetes. We can reverse it. You go on a ketogenic diet, you can reverse your diabetes. People who on average have had it for 8 years can reverse it in 10 weeks. That is what a large randomized controlled clinical trial showed. Consistently, I mean, if we can do that, diabetes costs $1 billion a day. Like, let's just do that, balance the budget, and make America healthy. And elect me for president.
Well, I heard Paul Willis talk about carcass utilization earlier, and as someone who renders her own lard, I would love, is there Nyman Ranch lard yet? I would buy jars and jars and give it to people for Christmas, because I want lard from pastured, healthy animals raised by great farmers.
That's a great idea.
Okay,
that's a takeaway from this talk.
Right, that's what I always ask. Okay, if people take away one thing from your talk today, Nina, what should it be?
Oh, it should be: do not fear fat, do not fear eating meat. Saturated in fat and cholesterol do not cause heart disease, and enjoy your food.
Thanks so much.
Okay.